Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. My name is Miriam Fischer. I am the director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or KAS, in Malaysia. I would like to welcome all of you to this second webinar in our series on social market economy perspectives. The COVID pandemic is ongoing and it has had devastating effects on people's lives and livelihoods. And the ongoing lockdown has hit especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, very hard, which actually make up more than 98% of Malaysia's corporate sector. So we therefore see an urgent need for a well thought out government response and strategy to deal with the economic, but also the social repercussions of the crisis. In the Malaysian context, this involves effective deployment of Malaysia's high number of development-linked companies, or GLCs, especially to ensure employment, adequate supply of health services, support for SMEs, and a public delivery system that gets aid to those who need it quickly and effectively. In today's webinar, we therefore would like to discuss how the GLCs in Malaysia could be even more effectively deployed to help Malaysians out of this crisis. And I'm very, very glad to have such a wonderful panel of experts with us today. Thank you all very much for being here with us. And I would like to thank our moderator, Ibrahim Sani, who's gladly agreed to try out a new interactive format for today's discussion. So we're very much looking forward to that. Once again, welcome to all of you. I wish us a very interesting discussion, and I thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Miriam. And of course, for those participants that want to ask the panel questions, there are plenty of options and methods for you to ask. I think there's a chat box where you can direct your questions to the host. There's also the ability for you to hold your questions until towards the later end of the forum if you choose to do so as well. But whatever it is, we want this to be an interactive panel on the matter through our various chat facilities. With this, let's go into the forum proper. I'd like to invite Dato Sri Nazir give some opening remarks on today's topic, Dato Sri.
Thank you, Brahim. Thank you, Miriam, and thank you for having me today. What I thought I'd just do very briefly is to discuss the topic of the state of GLCs first, and then say a few things about the role of GLCs with the current pandemic. And I think it's important to understand that the GLCs today are in a state of flux. They are really almost unrecognizable from the GLC transformation program, which was, the very much the flagship program that brought GLCs together, transform and revitalize them post the Asian financial crisis. The GLCT was all about governance, performance, CSR, and to some extent, regionalization of leading Malaysian companies. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it certainly transformed the GLCs and improved their performance, so much so that we did have crowding out of the private sector, too little crowding in of the private sector, and perhaps too little privatization of companies that needn't have been in government. I was, as an investment banker, was advisor to many GLCs before the GLC transformation program. And I can assure you that management boards were chalk and cheese, performance of the companies was chalk and cheese. Of course, the Asian financial crisis introduced a lot of new GLCs, Renong, Axiata, and a few more. And these also became better governed compared to before the crisis. they were more sustainable, but of course, they also became less entrepreneurial at the same time. And today, what we have is GLCs actually almost everywhere in the economy. Malaysia, I've said it before, Malaysia doesn't really have an economy. We have a political economy, and the large presence of GLC is an integral part of that. Under the Najib administration, the rhetoric was the era of government knows best is over. But the reality is there was a proliferation of GLCs, of companies owned by government. Then under the PH government, what you had was almost a affirmation that every GLC position was a political appointment. Then under the PN government, this got taken further, that those positions were actually made largely of politicians. So I think we are on a dangerous trajectory insofar as GLCs is concerned. It's a complete contradiction of a basic principle of governance, which is that leadership matters. They set the tone for the organization. So if you don't have leaders with the right experience, expertise, or indeed right motivation, then you're going to have problems. Especially when you have leaders who are more concerned about personal popularity, dishing out jobs or contracts, then an organization can quickly rot. Now, I won't mention examples today or of what we've seen in the past, but there are plenty. Yeah. The good news, though, is I do hear that the MOF is doing some work at relooking at this whole situation. If I were to relook at it, I think that I would have a framework where we kind of redefine GLCs into four. One is what I would call the GICs, which is government investee companies who really are only owned by government because there isn't sufficient private capital to own them. So you get people like CIMB, Maybank, and so on. And the government just exists as another shareholder, and maybe you might need some rules to restrain the government's role as a shareholder. Then you got the GLCs, the strategic companies that governments need to own, like Petronas, maybe Malaysia Airlines, Tenaga, Telecom. Those are listed, might even have a golden government share, and they make it very public that their purpose is not just profit, but also impact, development impact as a whole. Then perhaps you have what you call government companies, and these are very different to GLCs. These are companies like DFIs, like Bank Pembangunan, which I chair today, the GLICs themselves, the state agencies, and so on. And these are really instruments of government. They are corporatized, but apart from that, they're instruments of government. Their priority is impact, not profit. And finally, you probably need a fourth category called TGCs, which are temporary government companies. And these are those businesses, many businesses which the government is in today, which doesn't need to be, and we need to go through a process of selling them. And this is also a very important process in terms of timing and transparency and so on and so forth. Now, so that's my view of the state of GLCs at the moment. Let me talk about the GLCs and the pandemic specifically. I mean, if you look at the 7 stimulus packages, there are frequent mentions of initiatives that have been channeled through GLCs. I mean, certainly you've seen various microcredit schemes by the likes of BSN, CGCs. You had the big corporate guarantee scheme through Dana Jamin and so on. So to the extent that government is mobilized to support the economy in this economy, there have been GLCs used for this necessity. There's also been some other direct giving by GLCs like Tenaga and rates and GLC rental subsidies and all that. And those, are, come into that gray area where they are listed companies, but they are also asked to do these kind of activities. Overall, I think, does the government do enough through GLCs? Well, you can always say government can do better, but to me, government's instrument of the many GLCs are instruments of government, and so you have to regard that in the context of how active the government has been as a whole. Beyond that, I think there's a real question about to what extent corporate Malaysia has stepped up with the crisis. Public government companies and private companies. I think we are a nation at war. And I think everyone needs to step up. Firstly, all private companies need to get involved in making sure their staff are practicing the right work practices. They must make sure, do their best to get everyone vaccinated and so on. Overall, I think what the government can do is to create a stronger sense of nation at war. Everyone needs to step up. I think private companies today and their owners are actually in a very good position. If you realize the stock market is actually up since the beginning of the pandemic. People who lose it, who are going to lose their job, have lost their jobs. People who cannot work have not been able to work. So there's widening inequality. And I think it's very important that people who have done well or done okay during this crisis step up and help. I mean, I got a lot of criticism when I mentioned the need for a windfall tax. But I think, I stand by it. We do need to find a way for the haves to actually step up at this time. I think, the government could come in and create more platforms to channel this effort from the private sector and other government companies. The voice of government on this, I think, needs to come forward. And I also must mention that in terms of, we have an issue here in terms of trust. So when we look at this, how we take, we collect money from the haves and have-haves to channel, I think trust, credibility of those channels is something we must look at. And finally, I think, I would just say that, the pandemic is the most important thing above all. And this shall pass, of course, but there are things we can do to deal with it better, in my view. And I think after that, it'll be time to prioritize the degeneration of GLCs that we've seen over the past 5-10 years. Thank you.
Strong note to continue, which is the degeneration of the GLCs. There's plenty to unpack there, but we'll go to Professor Terence Gomez of UM first. Prof. Terence, you have the floor. Terence, are you there?
Okay, can you hear me now, Ibrahim?
I can hear you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Sorry, I was on mute. I want to start first by thanking Dato Nazir for joining us. One of the reasons why we wanted Nazir to be here was...
Sorry, Prof. Can you on your video?
My video is on.
We can't see you, and we can only see your name.
I'm sorry, my video is on here. Okay, it's on now. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Ibrahim. Actually, the video was always on, but let me carry on. I wanted to start by thanking Nazir for joining us, because Nazir has been part of this GLC world for a long time. If anyone really understands the GLC world, it's Nazir. And I felt I'm very grateful to him for agreeing to engage with us in this dialogue about GLCs. Now, Nazir has done a good job, I feel, in covering major issues, but I want to take us back in history. Why was it that we even have this thing called GLCs? And for this, we go back, in fact, to the year 19. It started way back up, soon after, even before independence. They created these institutions to help bring about social justice. But the real change happened in 1970 when the new economic policy was created and also public enterprises were created to rectify many of the social problems. And I would argue in the 1970s, they did a very good job. But the problem is, subsequently, especially in the 1980s, and I'll argue most clearly in the 1990s, the GLCs became a tool which politicians in government felt they could capture and use it to serve their own vested interests. And that's where things began to go wrong. It was a mechanism to concentrate wealth. It was a mechanism to practice patronage. And it became a tool through which they could also dispense a lot of concessions to particular constituencies to win elections. So it has become a tool that is today really completely abused. If you forward to today, the problem is because GLCs can be abused by politicians in such a way, the number of GLCs in this country today is huge. If you look at the Pakatan Harapan manifesto, when they were hoping to win power in 2018, they themselves stated they have no clue how many GLCs there are in this country. And I know when we did a research on GLCs, even when we spoke to people, the Ministry of Finance, even they had no clue how many GLCs there are. What is interesting is this. We have GLCs now at many levels. We have it at the federal level and we have it at the state level. At the federal level, we have GLICs, as Nazir mentioned. They are Khazanah, PNB, EPF, Tabung Haji, and Minister of Finance Incorporated. And just these 7 control a whole volume, a large volume of publicly listed companies. And they control the largest, some of the largest publicly listed companies in this country. If you look at just the top 10, 7 of the top 10 companies in this country today, publicly listed firms, are GLCs. And the volume of market capitalization we're talking about is more than 40%. It's huge. Then we have ministries that are in business. And each ministry controls a large scale, large volume of unlisted firms. And then we have the state level. And at the state level, each of the 13 state governments have GLCs. How many GLCs are there today? Now, we have been calling for reforms for a long time, but there's been no interest on the part of politicians to bring about these changes, to quantify them, streamline them, get rid of the waste, those who are involved in a lot of wastage in the system, and identify what exactly are the roles of these different types of GLCs of the sort that Nazir just mentioned. I thought Pakatan would do that when they came to power. After all, Mahathir Mohamad himself, probably one of the key architects of this GLC system, said that this was a monster that we have to reform. But as soon as they came to power, they themselves realized that this is a world which they can use to consolidate their own power base. And so we saw no reforms. So let me now come to today. Why are we talking about this today? Last year, when we had the pandemic, when it broke out, the new finance minister, Tunku Zafrul, spoke about a government ecosystem. When he mentioned this government ecosystem as a mechanism to deal with the crisis, to get help down to the ground, to help companies and people, he was referring to the GLCs. Tunku Zafrul was also part of the GLC world. He understood it. And if you look at the first MCO and the response by the government, you can see that the government actually used the GLCs, the banks. The banks were used to institute moratoriums on loans. The utilities company, Tenaga, they cut prices for power consumption. The telecommunications firms were brought in to help provide better internet services. And more recently, we have seen pharmaceutical firms, Pharmaniaga, for example, playing a role in the economy. If you move forward to the present day, today, as we speak, we are now again in a total lockdown. The problem that we are seeing here is this. When we had the first lockdown, there was also a change of government. They used the GLCs, I would argue, to some extent, which was quite fruitful, and we saw some of the benefits from that. But subsequently, these politicians also realized to consolidate their power, they would give directorships in these GLCs to politicians who they needed to support their government. And then we begin to see the abuse of the GLCs. Today, what we are seeing is a huge range of GLCs, which can be used properly. But if you read the later statements made by Tunku Zafrul, saying we can't do it the same way. In fact, what we are seeing here is now GLCs which can be employed fruitfully, but don't seem to be coordinated well. My argument is that this GLC world, which we need to employ immediately, effectively, and in a transparent manner, is not being employed. The politicians in power today do not seem to know how to use these in a proper, coordinated way. I'm just talking, take one example, health and pharmaceuticals. We have GLCs in health and pharmaceuticals. If there's one thing we need now, it's for these two sectors, companies in these two sectors to work in a coordinated manner. Are they doing so? What about the banks? What are the roles of the banks? The DFIs, the Development Financial Institutions, Agro Bank, Bank Pembangunan, SME Bank, what are they doing? We have to address these questions, and this is my closing point, because as Miriam said at the opening, 98.5% of the corporate sector are SMEs. What Miriam did not point out was about 900,000 there are about 1.2 million companies. About 900,000 of these companies are actually micro firms. We've been told by the SME Association, if we do not do something now to help the SMEs, at least 40% of them will go under. We're talking about 400 to 500,000 companies. That would mean about 2 million people unemployed. The situation is dire. And what of the informal sector? If we bring in the informal sector, where we have people in the informal sector running enterprises which are not registered, the number shoots up. We're talking about, including the microfirms, about 2.8 million enterprises in business. That is the crisis we are now confronted with. What is the role of the GLCs? This is the discussion we are now going to have. Thank you, Ibrahim.
Thanks, Prof. What a lively topic and a lovely picture that you have painted. We continue on this conversation with Trisha. Trisha, I just want to ask you about your opinions on the opening remarks by Dato Nazir and Prof. Terence. Do you share the same sentiment as they do? Do you feel that there is a greater role for the GLCs to play in today's day and age?
Thank you so much to Ibrahim, and very good afternoon to my fellow panelists, Dato Sri Nazir Razak, Prof. Terence Gomez, and Iskandar Faris from REFSA. Thank you to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, as well as to My Futures Malaysia for inviting me today. So I will spend this first session to respond to the remarks of the previous two speakers, and then maybe also come into a little bit of the topic itself today. So I agree with the large bulk of what the panelists have already said, but I can also offer some of my own views. So I think historically, the GLCs definitely were set up all across Malaysia, not just at the national, but also state level from 1971. This was really a response to the 1960s economic structures. And of course, throughout the years, they have had a very strategic importance to play. They form 34% of our market share. So they exist very largely in our Malaysian economy. I think there have been two problems, if I can narrow it down. What are the two problems that GLCs have experienced, and why are people so critical of these? So number one, I think Prof. Terence has talked about this, and this one you hear all the time, political intervention. And so this is where you see the political appointments at the board, or political appointments as chair. So that's one big thing that we have not been able to address. But I think the second thing, which probably analysts address less of, is the performative efficiencies, or rather the lack of efficiencies. And this is where breaking down what the GLCs are within that ecosystem is really important. So I really like what Dato Sri Nazir did in breaking down into the 4 different categories. So let me kind of give a few ways of seeing the GLCs, right? So one, I think we need to distinguish between the GLCs and statutory bodies. So what's the difference there? Statutory bodies are bodies that have been set up by statute, by enactment. So they exist by virtue of the law. The statute allows their existence. The second category of GLCs, of government-linked companies, I mean, these are formed under companies. So they have the same powers as any other company in the Companies Commission. We also need to distinguish, so that's one way of distinguishing between the two. The second distinction is to distinguish between publicly listed GLCs and all the rest. So when you look at performative efficiency, I think those that are under public listed entities, they perform better because they are managed, they are scrutinized by the Securities Commission. They have higher standards to meet because essentially they're responsible to the public. Whereas the scores and hundreds and perhaps thousands of others that we don't know the number or the figure of at the national or the state level, they report to, say, the Companies Commission, but they are not under as stringent a requirement as reporting to the Securities Commission. So the ones that are not publicly listed actually have a lower standard to meet. So I also want to propose a sort of framework as to how we want to decide upon the need for government to be involved in a certain GLC or not. Actually, the technical term is state-owned enterprises. So if you look at comparisons between Malaysia and other similar GLCs and entities around the world, the literature actually talks about it as SOEs. So they are state-owned enterprises. We have a sort of framework which we have not yet published. So actually, this is a really good time to talk about it and maybe to get some feedback. The question that we actually ask, we want to ask, right, at Ideas is there a strategic need for government to be in this business or not? So what do we mean by strategic? So I think what we've done is like categorize these into three broad categories. One, they could exist for the purpose of providing recapitalization. So like the DFIs, the Development Financial Institutions. Number two, they could also be providing a strategic need for economic development. So I think this second category is where most of the GLCs in Malaysia in the 1970s and 80s started off with providing a national economic development strategy for the country, because we clearly knew we wanted to alleviate poverty. We clearly knew we wanted to restructure the economy in some way. The third perhaps would be in infrastructure and public service. So this is where you talk about the public good, right? So if it is a legal monopoly, if it is the only provider of service, then yes, there can be a justification for why government needs to be within these entities. So the tricky question here is, if it answers no to any of the above, then the question would be, why is government still within that particular sector? If it does not perform an economic development role, if it is not involved in the business of infrastructure and providing public service, if it is not there to have recapitalization or providing developmental financial assistance, why is it there? So I think we would take the position that if there's no strategic need for a GLC to be there in existence, then we should really start to think about divestment. However, we also understand that some companies just cannot have immediate divestment because you don't have private companies to take up these shares immediately. So if it can be divested immediately, then we look at commercial ways of doing that. If it cannot be divested immediately, then we need to think about perhaps doing a periodical review and from time to time evaluate as to when it is they should be getting out of that particular sector. I want to go now into the question of today, which is on the GLC support during the pandemic. So Ideas actually has been doing a very, very sort of thorough analysis, very detailed. I think it might bore most of you. It's very technocratic. And we've done an analysis of all the stimulus packages that the government has ever announced from the beginning till now. And based on the numbers and the figures that have been reported in the Laksana report. So I think I have to say that the Ministry of Finance Laksana reports have been very good. They have been quite comprehensive in providing information about the numbers that have been spent and so on. And we've calculated everything and we found that out of the 100% of the stimulus packages, 37% of that comes from the ecosystem itself alone. And in addition to the 37%, you've got about maybe 9-10%, which are combination of ecosystem plus either government or private sector. So what this tells you is that, you know, almost 50% of all the stimulus packages that have been announced in response to the pandemic actually have been contributed to by the GLC ecosystem. And I think this is the question to ask, right? So this is something that I also want to provoke, perhaps in a way. Should the GLCs be the ones that are dependent upon to provide aid? I think that's what we are talking about today, right? Should the GLCs be the entities that are dependent upon to provide aid? And some perspectives of how I think we should make that judgment or that conclusion. Number one, I think that GLCs can provide some support. However, we need to think about whether these are short-term rather than long-term solutions. We should admit that in the long term, it is actually the government's responsibility to do that, not necessarily the GLCs. Number two, who is monitoring whether the GLC pledges will be actually delivered? Because one could perhaps conceivably monitor government pledges because, for example, I mentioned earlier that Laksana produces these reports and entities like ours at Ideas, we will monitor those. But we don't have the capacity to monitor the pledges of all GLCs. And a very good example would be the 150 million ringgit contribution from GLCs for the provision of laptops to students in 500 schools. Do we have the capacity to know whether these laptops have in fact been distributed? I think the answer is no. Number three, I think it is also important that the aid is reflected and accounted for through transparent publication, and also very importantly, for risk assessment and risk mitigation. So if the GLCs as the ecosystem are the ones that are providing all this aid, does that actually make it easier or more difficult for us to assess how much risk, how much financial burden it is that is being carried by the GLCs? And there are many other metrics that I think we need to think about and consider very carefully if we are going to depend so much on the GLCs to do this. For example, if the public resources are scarce, how much of government itself will be dependent on to bail out GLCs that have perhaps needed to go in the red in order to provide the necessary medical/non-medical aid in response to the pandemic? So the question really is, okay, if all these GLCs are helping, and if they end up going in the red because of the aid, then which of these GLCs will government step in to save at the end of the day? And who makes that decision actually within the government itself? So objective criteria needs to be made to minimize market distortions. And finally, if there are any of these GLCs that have been dependent upon a lot, then what is the exit strategy to avoid distorting the level playing field, right? By granting the GLCs this undue advantage in the medium and long term. So I will stop there. Just to say that this is not a phenomenon that Malaysia itself is only experiencing. Many other countries are grappling with these very same exact questions about, in times of emergency, in times of crises such as today, what role should the GLCs play and for how long should they do that? And the good thing is that because it's an issue that many countries are grappling with, we can also look to best practices and examples as to what kind of objective criteria we should use to determine to what extent GLCs can come into the ecosystem to play a helping hand at the time of need. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Trisha. This boils down to some of the questions that have already been posed. People are asking a lot right now on the chat box. Colin Swee from Project 57 is asking, if we were to embark on reforms, is there a model from another country or a parallel case study that we can emulate? Iskandar, perhaps you can talk about this as well. Also, I'd like to invite you to the floor to give your opening remarks.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, organizers, Konrad Adena Stiftung. Also, thank you and welcome to all the panelists, fellow panelists, Dato Sri Nazir, Professor Teres Gomez, Trisha from Ideas. Great job at breaking down the types of GLCs that we have currently. On that, because you guys have managed to break it down to that level, I think I'll just straight away comment on what the GLCs have done so far, or the state-owned enterprises have done so far. and what can be done moving forward. So for the current measures or up to today, I think currently the measures by GLCs can be categorized as about ad hoc, unorganized, sometimes incidental, and inconsistent across GLCs. But this is a reflection of a larger problem where we have lack of coordination between ministries as well. Because we see that GLCs report to a minister or a ministry. Some of the state, like FELDA and other statutory bodies, they report to their respective ministers. So there is a lack of coordination among the GLCs because there are a lack of coordination among the ministers as well. So since this is the case, and we know this is the case because recently a minister just criticized his fellow cabinet members regarding health matters and vaccines. So if this is the case, we need to improve coordination among ministries, as well as improve oversight for these GLCs. So when I say we need more coordination, we need to ask ourselves, we have been in this pandemic for more than a year, and this is not our first lockdown. But what have the government, either through GLCs or through other levels of instruments of government, have done to, number one, ensure food security is assured? Number two, what have the government done, either through GLCs or other agencies, to ensure that testing capacity has been boosted, testing capacity and capabilities? Have they mobilized the health instruments of GLCs to innovate and also measure up in this kind of KPI? About training healthcare personnel, since we don't have the testing capacity, vaccinating capacity, and also quarantine facilities that can support the need of the current society. What has the GLC, what have they done to make sure that these areas have been satisfied? Regarding digital capabilities, we are looking at education. They are in dire need of facilities, solutions to implement digital learning from home. In other ways, healthcare also, we need to improve the capabilities of digital. In other countries, we are exploring telemedicine. How far are we since, or how far more are we to reach that kind of capability in Malaysia? If we see some people, they have mobility issues to go to the hospital, how are we getting the care needed for them to their own residence? And I think the longer term question is, we believe GLCs should be utilized, but at a more efficient manner and more effective manner. So we must reorient the GLCs or GLICs to achieve a common societal goal. And I echo what Trisha said, we need to streamline. Some of them might overlap. If we look at digitization alone, there are many government agencies, there are many GLCs looking into it. What are they doing? What areas are they servicing? And how do they overlap? We don't want to have new GLCs. We don't want to create new GLCs. We don't want to create new government agencies to recreate the wheel, whereas we already have the necessary resources in the market. So when we talk about long term, the roles of GLCs and GLCs should be optimized. We need to pay attention to their unique fiduciary duties and requirements. Some of them need to serve the interests of unit holders like EPF, QA. Like Khazanah, they have a more strategic interest to reshape or shape the market so that we have strategic assets and the economy is resilient enough to weather any storms that might be coming to our shores. So this ambition to leverage this institution towards a new industrial policy and economic growth for the next decade, we need to build following the pandemic. But there are concerns that, like I said earlier, there are competing social mandates between agencies, and also leakages and corruption that needs to be addressed. At REFSA, we believe GLCs are trailblazers, which serves two purposes. In their current existing sector, they need to up the game of the sector or up the game of players within the sector. They serve as a forefront of innovation because of the resources that they have and the knowledge that they have accumulated over the years. They should be one of the pioneers or front runner in digitizing or innovating the sector. So we're talking about probability of digitizing farming, agri-tech, or bring in state-of-the-art healthcare facilities like telemedicine. All this kind of innovation that might be out of reach or a bit far out of reach by private companies without the necessary investment capacity. For new sectors that we might want to look into, we can consider GLCs as angel investors or seed funders. Now, I don't mean that we need to pick winners here. So for us, we look at it in a different perspective of challenges, grand challenges of society. So if the government, so this is where I said it goes beyond just the GLCs, the government has to set a goal or an overarching industrial policy that caters or targets or addresses the grand challenges faced by society. So let's say now we are in a pandemic. So the grand challenge might be to make Malaysia pandemic resilient. So in that kind of sense, the government has to be a convener where it brings together public sector, GLCs, the private players, high learning institutions, research bodies to come up with a solution for the necessary problem. So it's not about picking like in the past where the government makes a pivot for the industry, or we move from rubber to palm oil because we need to have that kind of export capacity. But now it's more of identifying what needs to be done in the society to answer specific challenges and come up with a mission to overcome it together. So that is where I say GLCs play a role of trailblazers. For the second role, I would say a proponent of stakeholder capitalism. So in the age where private companies, even in Davos, people are advocating for more of a social purpose for private companies, lagi-lagi lah, GLC have to play the front runner or leading role in championing this. Environment, social, and governance concerns should be at the forefront or front of mind for the leaders of GLCs. And it should not just fulfill the purpose of GLC should not just to serve shareholders, but stakeholders as well. We are talking about the workers, clients, consumers, and also the environment. We can say it as a profit motive with a purpose. So why are we talking about this? Because it's not just forming a new consensus among private companies or private players. Even consumers are becoming, if I may say in a colloquial manner, a bit more woke and prefer purpose-driven companies. You see big MNCs going towards this purpose direction. So there is a need for GLCs to review their priorities, to take more of a stakeholder capitalism approach in a way that means it needs to get with the times, facilitate measures that gives more benefits or gives more progressive policies, implement more progressive policies within their circle of influence. For example, paying fair wages and salaries, pioneering progressive benefits like paid parental leaves, wellness leaves, reducing CEO worker pay ratio, diversity, ensuring diversity at the workplace. And lagi-lagi in this COVID environment, ensuring safety at the workplace. Are the workplaces pandemic resilient? Can it curb transmission if one person is discovered as positive? How about the dormitories or the living quarters of the workers? That kind of standards needs to be set. And of course, all this purpose is for naught if we don't fix oversight and coordination. Governance system needs to be strengthened to avoid any pitfalls that have traumatized GLCs and the public severely in the past. So we need GLCs to regain the trust, to set a benchmark, and to win back the credibility from the public. I think that's all for me for now. We can continue conversation with other questions.
Yeah, so let's bring in all the panel together. Dr. Nazir, Prof. Terence, Trisha, and Iskandar. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the items that was or could be debated, which is number one, the purpose of having a GLC. It seems like right now GLCs are being created left, right, and center, and we haven't even jumped into the ministries, the state excos. Interesting that, for instance, when Trisha says things like, if it serves no economic role, if it serves no public service, and if it serves no function of recapitalization of strategic assets, then why do we have it, right? But it seems like we have it. And right now, how do we move forward? We need more GLCs. It seems like GLCs for political appointment. So just by the whole essence of having a GLC seems to be questionable. Any panelists want to ask or respond to my question? Do you feel that there is, in order for us to look at the role of the GLCs, we got to take a long, hard look into the creations of future GLCs. Do we need a handbrake on this one, panelists?
I can have a go. I mean, I think that we're all roughly on the same page in terms of the need to relook at the role of GLCs and the need for so many GLCs. I think, you know, from my kind of breakdown into 4 types of GLCs, Trisha's idea that, you know, we go through this filter, that filter is what is needed for my 4th category, which is what I call temporary GLCs. These should be put aside as tu akan dijual GLCs. I would, you know, just reflect on the GLC transformation, and you know, when we ran a GLC, when you run a GLC under at that time, and that was probably what was needed at that time, when you're running a GLC, then you're going to do, you're told that you have to deliver performance comparable to the private sector, right? I remember when, you know, running CIMB, if, you know, public bank is doing 18% ROE, then CIMB has to do 18% ROE. Yep. So that gets your competitive, muscles up, right? Because you're going to do whatever it takes to get to the 18%. Yeah. If you start talking about purpose and other things, it just convoluted thinking, right? We're just going to drive our business, and then we're going to muscle everybody aside. And we've got a lot of muscles because, you know, we've got this GLC network. So that's why I talk about crowding out the private sector. So and that also led to proliferation. CIMB creates subsidiary. Is Touch and Go today a government-linked company? It is owned by CIMB. Is it a government-linked company? Now, if you define CIMB as a government-linked company and you take all of CIMB's subsidiaries as a government-linked company, then you're talking about thousands and thousands of really thousands of companies between the subsidiaries of these companies that I don't think the GLC definition is useful at all. The government happens to be a shareholder of CIMB, Maybank, Axiata. They shouldn't be called a GLC, right? And these people's mandates are to serve all shareholders. The government is one. Right. So when we talk about, you know, the GLCs in the case of this pandemic, I think you need to separate between those GLCs which, you know, have really private mandates versus those GLCs that are really, you know, instruments of government. Like Bank Pembangunan today is an instrument of government, right? We're 100% owned by government. We're just a vehicle for government policy. So whatever the government wants, it can either do it itself or it can channel through Bank Pembangunan with all our resources. So I think, for this whole question about role of GLC in the pandemic, it's very important that we start, separating between, these sort of government instruments versus those public companies that government are shareholder. For those companies, I think I go back to my point that we need to lump them together with the private sector and ask the question whether companies, as a whole, are doing enough to help the nation in this time of war.
I'd like to add on to what Nazir has said. I especially want to respond to Trisha. The point here is that we have no clue what this GLC work looks like. I already mentioned the GLCs, which include 1MD, which include Khazanah. I mentioned the trust funds, CPF, PNB. We have talked about unlisted firms, and we have talked about those at a state level. The concern with our discussion here today is it seems to be targeted primarily at publicly listed firms. But the GLC world is far, far bigger than just these publicly listed firms. I would like to talk about the statutory bodies. Trisha raised the point about the statutory bodies. This is a very important point because statutory bodies, we are talking about institutions like Kesedah, Ketengah, that's the South Johor Development Authority, the Lembaga Kemajuan Wilayah Kedah. These were institutions that were created in rural areas to help the poor. They were supposed to help develop, say, for example, the agriculture sector. Now, we've got to think about how we want to reform those institutions too, because today, one of the key issues in this country is food security. And these are the institutions which should be pushing aid into the agriculture sector. But do you know, among SMEs in this country, only 1.1% of our companies are in agriculture. This is why we have a security problem. Are there institutions that we can use to aid rural industries in agriculture? Yes, they are. Are they being deployed well? No, they are not. So the first thing we need to do is map out this world, get to the heart of which are the agencies we need to deploy immediately, especially to deal with the crisis. And then, of course, there's also the long term. Here I agree. We can divest some non-strategic companies. I have no problems with that. We can create a sovereign wealth fund where we divest it to the sovereign wealth fund for the time being if you're worried about putting government wealth in the hands of private people, making the rich richer, for example. Then what of the re-engineering of the GLCs that we still need to participate in the economy? Remember this, 98.5% of the corporate sector SMEs. The role of the government is to aid SMEs to develop a vibrant SME sector. The role of the government is not to crowd out these SMEs. The role of the government is to create dynamic enterprises that will be the agents for generating growth. And that is to be found primarily in the SME sector. But who supports these SMEs? And that is why when I started out, I made it very clear, we need institutions like the SME Bank. We need institutions like Bank Pembangunan, and that's why I was pleased to see Nazir here to join us. How will these DFIs play the role to help these SMEs, particularly now at the time of need? So I want to talk in terms of short-term and long-term. Short-term, we know they have to intervene, and they have to intervene now. How they have to intervene, that's what we need a discussion on. Long-term, we'll need the long-term. Long-term, we can look at the bigger picture. What needs to be divested, we divest. What needs to be closed down, we close down. And what needs to be reformed, we reform.
Yeah, can I also respond? So this is really nice conversation. We mostly agree with each other. It would be nice if we disagreed a little bit, then there'll be a more interesting discussion. But I just want to add a couple of points. So number one, talking about statutory bodies. So the research that we've done when we looked at the data, so we actually mined this data, right? And it takes a lot of time. So we calculated there are 136 statutory bodies at the national level. But so the interesting thing is that even though they are set up at the national level, 15 of them are state specific. So some of these are yayasans or like, for ports, say for instance, in Penang and in other states. So out of the 136, we have 16 commodity, 31 education, 17 financial, 3 GLIC, 54 regulatory, and 15 state-specific statutory bodies. So this is really where the homework begins, right? Because you start looking through one by one. What role do each of these statutory bodies serve? and we go through that filtration process of what we talked about earlier. But I just wanted to talk about, so Ibrahim, when you asked the question of the number of GLCs and also if the government were to set up new ones, right? I mean, that already sends like alarm bells, I think, in our heads. Setting up new ones, we don't even have a monitor to track the ones that already exist. What more setting up new ones? And the problem is that when you don't have a body that monitors and tracks or even has a list of all the GLCs in the country, it's very, very difficult to know which ones should survive and which ones should not. There was a question by Colin Sui earlier about best practices. Many countries do have, say, a ministry or a body under the Prime Minister's office or something like that at a high level position that sets out standards for all of its GLCs. And this is something I believe is sorely needed. I believe several years ago, there was talk of an SOE Governance Act, a State-Owned Enterprise Governance Act, which was supposed to be drafted by Khazanah. Granted, this was actually in response to the then TPPA, which then fell through. However, I'm very interested to know now that Malaysia is in discussions over the CPTPP and the negotiation to sign and ratify, like whether or not this is something that's on the table. So if there's anyone from the Ministry of Finance there, like, would love to know, is there an SOE Governance Act that's being drafted in line with the CPTPP negotiations? The last thing to say right now is, I think, government has sometimes a problem of its own conflict of interest. And why do I say that? I say that because we know that one of government's primary role is to help the flourishing of SMEs, in particular, Bumiputra SMEs, right? So let's acknowledge that the government does play a role in promoting Bumiputra enterprise. But by having so many GLCs in similar sectors in which Bumiputra SMEs themselves would be trying to compete in, they're actually shooting themselves in the foot. And I can give you a real life example because IDEAS has been doing this work for many years. Prof. Terence has been part of that process as well. And there was actually a company that contacted us and said that, oh, we are so happy with the research that you're doing because we are exactly that. We are a Bumiputra company that's trying to compete in a space that is facing difficulties because government-linked companies are entering that space and pushing us out of that space, whereas we are a genuine Bumiputra company. So this was, it really set off a light bulb in my head. And this always comes to mind whenever I talk about GLCs because that actually is government's conflict of interest. Here you are trying to play a role of helping Bumiputra companies, but at the same time, the GLCs are actually crowding out the ability of such companies to flourish and compete in the market. So I'll stop for now.
Yep, I'll just add some of the panelists' feedback earlier. It's interesting that there's a common thread of lack of coordination going around. So I would like to pick up on that point and then bring it back to the point of role of government, because GLCs were created by government, and the point or the lack of coordination is the resemblance of what is lacking with government itself. So if we take a background from the world's recent experience with COVID-19, it's clear that government plays a major role in the economy, and markets are not perfect, but because the world is dynamic, new challenges keep emerging, and every decade there will be new earthquakes or tectonic shifts that we need to respond to. COVID-19 being one of it, climate change, food security. So when we see this lack of coordination between GLCs and the replicative role of different GLCs, and some GLCs were created to then go counterintuitive with its raison d'etre, we are seeing a lack of proactiveness from the government. For the longest time, the government has taken a back seat and letting the market go, only to intervene when deemed necessary. That I think it has lost the institutional memory to do proactive problem solving. So in this day and age of pandemic, we need to rebuild that capacity, rebuild the capacity for proactive problem solving, and eventually rebuild this institutional memory of the state. So I point out one potential downside of not having this capacity being built right now or in the future. If we outsource in the future, the outsourcing coordinator or the project manager would likely be the state, either civil service or agency within that kind of ambit. But if we don't build that kind of capacity to identify what is the problem and then how this solution or potential solution given by an agency or a vendor can solve the problem, then there is a potential of vendor capture or agency capture that will trap our state or our government into unfavorable circumstances. We've seen this multiple times. We put out tenders or vendor to call vendors for IT projects because the lack of capacity or understanding of the IT infrastructure and environment, we have been tricked. It's the same like if you go to a workshop but you don't know what your car is, the type of your car, and then what engine goes in it, you might just taken for a ride by the workshop owner. So that building of capacity, that training needs to start if it hasn't started already. So it's not just, when we talk about GLC, it's not just talking about the GLC ecosystem. It goes back to the government coordination and how we build talent and capability within the government. The government needs to be proactive to pivot the economy when it is needed, because believe you me, this would not be the last pandemic or crisis that we're going to face. So better to start now, build that capacity, as long as when we build the capacity for the government to have some sort of capability to address grand challenges through a private and public partnership, then I think we will be better prepared to face any other crises or any other problems in the future.
Thank you. Questions are coming in hard and fast, but first I want to address Lawrence Chu, who says that some of the ideas and conversations raised in this panel should be recorded and submitted to the government for their planning purposes. Rest assured, Lawrence, we are recording this. However, the submission to the government for their planning purposes remains to be seen. We need to talk to the organizer on that. Of the 7 questions that we've had so far, particularly from Scott Jordan, which I find quite ironic, because he says, perhaps this is an oversimplification, and then proceeds to write a very long question to a point where it was truncated because it didn't carry enough, too much characters. But that's a good point, because he was asking, Malaysia seems to be in an identity crisis. It seems like we are saying that we are a market capitalistic, free market country supporting laissez-faire. But it seems like because of the intricacies and the complexities of the SOEs, GLCs, both state and national, let alone the classification between what Ideas had at 136 and what Terence Gomez had. And then I saw what Terence had. It was really scary. It was on my show. I put it up on my show on my TV. It was just messed up. All right, it's just a lot. And by the way, that was just national. We haven't gone to state yet. So it seems like there seems to be a cultural identity issue. Whether or not this is down to the people itself, or is it the system that we have? Is it that are we really a socialist country pretending to be a market capitalistic country? And I think we need to address Scott's question first before we jump to all the other questions. Go ahead. Any panelist wants to take this?
Okay, let me start. The issue about the identity crisis that we have is interesting. I remember clearly when Najib Razak became Prime Minister, he said that, well, the best form of government is a small government. And he set up Pemandu, and one of the things Pemandu was supposed to do was to look into the issue of privatization. There was a lot of dialogue about privatization in his first year. But subsequently, if you look at his statements, there was no more discussion on privatization. In fact, privatization became a footnote in the Pemandu reports. The focus really was on revamping the GLC, the state. Now, this is important because we are recognizing here that the government of the day, Najib, the reason Najib did that was also because when he proposed this, he also made another important point. He said, no more affirmative action, no more Bumiputra policy, let me be blunt. And then there was a backlash. And subsequently, if you look at the Najib administration, especially in 2013, he created a new Bumiputra policy called the Bumiputra Economic Empowerment Policy. And he said the GLCs must implement it. Yes, we have a problem. The GLC world is very closely linked to the policy world. And the policy world is very closely linked to the world of politics. That is the issue here. That is the elephant in the room. Why is there no attempt to deconstruct this GLC monster and to shape it up and use it properly? Because there's no political will to do so. And we were tested this when Pakatan came to power. Pakatan had the opportunity to do it, and look what they did. They did nothing because they recognized that world can be used. And Pakatan too, after saying in their manifesto, we are going to have a needs-based policies, no more race-based policies, then comes up with their own shared prosperity vision, which is quite racialized in its rhetoric. And who is at the center of these policies? The GLCs. That is our problem. We are not discussing it. So I think the question which was posed to us, we have to deal with that question too. So there are very complex issues here we have to deal with. And I do feel that these issues need to be tackled if first the political questions, the policy questions, and then we can move into the reform of the GLC world. I think the GLC world can be reformed very quickly. Set up an independent commission, bring in the right people, do this quickly and get it done. Get the useless GLCs out of the system, get the statutory bodies functioning properly, get the publicly listed firms to play their role too. It can be done quickly, but there's no will to do so. So let me stop here because I think I've put on the table something which I feel the panel has to discuss.
Yeah, so panelists, do you feel that there is no political will?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in here. But just in immediate response to that, I've always felt that Malaysia actually has the worst of both worlds, meaning that when you try and analyze an economy as to whether it is more socially oriented versus whether it's more market oriented, Malaysia has, in effect, the worst of both social economy and the market economy because we have a large public sector, which can be actually, when you analyze it, not very efficient. And that's just putting it mildly. And the market economy, we've had very poorly privatized process in the 1990s. I think we have attempted privatization, but the privatization process itself was not done professionally. And so what happened was that Malaysians ourselves have a very poor understanding of what a real market economy could look like. So this is why when we hear the word privatization, it sends very bad signals down to us because we have not seen a good experience of that. Whereas actually this could be better done in a country that perhaps is less crony oriented. So it's very difficult. You can't really say socially oriented or market oriented because we've actually taken the crony version of both and incorporated it into this model of what we have today. I just want to respond to Prof. Terence, and I think this is really hitting at the heart of it, right? So let me tell you something that Ideas is also working on, which is completely separate, supposedly, from the question of GLC reform. So while we are working on GLC reform, we are also working on something else, which is political funding reform, right? Political financing reform. And one of the questions that is coming out in that stream of discourse is whether or not GLCs should be permitted to provide funds, whether in form of money or in kind, to political parties. And I can say that that discussion is rife with disagreement because of the way our political economy has been structured. You will not find a party or a politician that is really truly able to say that, no, we don't want to depend on GLCs any longer, whether in financial or material or in kind forms. And I find that to be really problematic because if we cannot even imagine a future in which the GLCs would not be depended on to provide political aid, then this means that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our political structures are formed.
Yes.
It means that the fact that GLCs need to be called on for help, what does that say about the way political parties and the economy is structured? And one final point, why does this concern all of us? If we are not a political party member, why does that concern us? It concerns us because the government still has a role. Why it's called a GLC or an SOE is because government still takes the ultimate responsibility for bearing the financial burden of a GLC. This is where your budget discussion comes in. This is where your off-budget discussion comes in. Contingent liabilities. What happens to the security of our future public economy if the government is securing the debts and liabilities of these multiple GLCs that are actually being depended upon for political ends? And I'm not trying to be, I am really trying to understand how to untangle ourselves from this mess. Because if I was a political party member and if I was asked whether GLCs should be removed from this process, I would be concerned too, because I as a politician would need certain funds to fund the way I operate. So I think this really requires it requires sequencing, but it also requires a very careful understanding and analysis of how these things are interlaced and interlinked. And at least from my point of view, we've been trying to think of new solutions out of this rut by having conversations with the people involved and the stakeholders involved themselves. But I must say that the public should be concerned because it ultimately rests on public funds as well.
I think the public is concerned, but before that, I saw Dato Nazir was writing rather intently or furiously. I don't know which adjective, but you want to chime in on the matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll make 2 points. One is a small one, which is perhaps in terms of the conversation, it's good to reflect on why we suddenly call everything GLCs. I mean, Trisha brought up the concept of SOEs. I mean, to me, to have a conversation and lump, CIMB, Axiata together, the Kesedar Ketengah is a waste of time. Yeah. In the end of the day, they're fundamentally very different beasts. State-owned enterprises, with social objectives versus government, partly government-owned companies with, meant to go out there and compete with the best companies in the world. We're talking about two different things. I mean, I don't know when these two got lumped in. I really don't know. Because certainly under the GLC transformation program, there was no mention of these other SOEs, if you like. It wasn't even in the same grouping. But anyway, so that's one point. Kemudian, in terms of this whole question of identity crisis, of course it is. In the end of the day, as I keep saying, and I will sound like a broken record here, at the heart of our problem is three things. I talk about this three-headed monster. It's money politics, identity politics, and over-centralization of power. Those are the three heads of the monster that really has driven us to this point. And this state of GLCs is a symptom of the three-headed monster, right? Everything needs, and if you want to talk about reforms, you cannot reform without relooking at the whole thing, the problem as a whole. Everything is interlinked. You talk about political funding reform. It was tried under the previous BN administration, and BN is saying, oh, but the opposition then did not agree to this political funding reform. I mean, of course, people will not agree to political funding reform when the essence of political funding reform is transparency. Who wants to be transparent when you think that the incumbent, the incumbent party is in control of all instruments of power, right? You disclose who donated to you, then the guy who donated to you suddenly has tax problems, right? So that is a non-starter. You cannot do political funding reform unless you actually have a proper independent referee governing the whole system of political competition in this country. And then if you look at we touch on the Najib reforms, if you like, at the beginning of his administration. Not too different. Pak Lah at the beginning of the administration also tried reforms. Pakatan went in with this great manifesto that will solve all our problems. And the real politic of it comes to bear as soon as you start doing these things. And it's very difficult because of this three-headed monster. And if you look at the most beautiful document of all, I think, was the NEM, the New Economic Model. And there is a paragraph in there that was really prescient, that look, in the end of the day, all these things will require enormous political will, something like that, I paraphrase. And because the vested interest and the political dynamics against these reforms that we recommended are going to be enormous. In the end, that report just went on the shelf. What happened? Instead of the NEM, Najib implemented the ETP, where we had 131 projects. And then it felt good, like, you basically just do projects, forget about the structural reforms, right? You awarding all these contracts, a lot of investment in the country, it felt very good. And then you shove the structural reforms, which is really what we really need in order for us to really break out of this quandary that we're in.
Just to add to the conversation, firstly, I'd like to address the question about what type of economy are we? So I think it's not a question of big or small government. We are what we are, but now the question is what do we do with the resources that we have? What purpose should the resources be funneled into so that we achieve a better well-being for everyone? And while we are talking about that, we also touched a bit just now about governance. Dato Sri, Terence, and Trisha touched upon it now and repeatedly about governance and how we need to improve the governance of SOEs or GLCs or GLICs. I mean, I guess why people are conflating everything into one, I guess that's the perception of the public. We cannot just deny it because people are seeing one or the other as the same now. So I think that's also a question we need to ask. Why are people perceiving it that way? There could be a signaling effect by the different structures, organizations that somehow show to the public that, oh, we are kind of the same. And then how the government is treating each and every one of them could also signal that there are not much difference between one or the other. In recommending reforms, I'd like to highlight two guiding principles first, which are, number one, if we want to reform, we need to think about the uniqueness between each of these GLCs, between one another, including what their mandates are and how are they recognized. So this goes back to how one might not be the same, the statutory bodies might not be the same as GLCs. So we need to recognize that. Number two, the governance of GLCs and GLCs should be reformed to avoid past pitfalls and set the stage for greater government agenda setting. So we talk about purpose, but also how to make sure that this purpose are achieved. So we need that kind of governance platform or mechanism set in. So the recommendations I would like to push forward, even though this is high level, it's not really detailed, but I guess it could be the building blocks for future discussions are threefold, or three items. Number one, a centralized overarching philosophy and strategy of GLCs and GLICs. So let's say if it's an enterprise, if the GLC is an enterprise, so then the mandate shall be as per its memorandum and articles of association, the MNAs. If it's a statutory body, then mandate for that GLC should be determined by the act of the body. That's number one. For number two, we need to have a sophisticated governance and accountability model consistent across of GLCs and GLICs. So this is where the tedious process of going through what kind of GLCs, what type of GLCs do we have. I think Trisha and Professor Terence have done much of the heavy work, but I think more of like we need to drill down further. What are the states GLCs that we need to find out and come up with a governance or accountability model. Contohnya, for example, let's say if you want to appoint a chairperson for the board, must he or she go through a fit and proper test by a regulating entity? Should we use parliament as a check and balance for appointments to the board? So when we say parliament, it's a bipartisan approach. So it's not just monopolized by the current government, but we have people or representatives from the opposition as well to make sure that there is no hanky-panky or just whims and fancy of the government being afforded to. Number three, lastly, is performance management system and reporting mechanism. So we talk about purpose, we talk about objectives, we talk about challenges. Other than the financial results or outcome that we see from the organization, how do we quantify or actually identify whether the purpose of the organization, the body, or the company has been fulfilled or being on track to be fulfilled? So these are some hard questions. I don't think we can resolve it today, but it proves as a good starting point if you want to think about reforms for GLCs.
We need to go through some of the questions pretty fast, but before I do that, I got a personal message from a participant here, and he was saying, basically addressing to Dato Nazir that I'm sorry you feel that you sound like a broken record, but that was the first time that he has heard it, so continue to be a broken record. Many people will hear it for the first time. That was a comment. Moving along, I feel I want to do justice to the people that ask the questions, but I feel that there's a theme surrounding a few questions. Jan Ayub of Kazana, Uy Kibang of Penang Institute, Arup Chelvan Subramaniam, as well as Prof. Geoffrey Williams of MUST, basically talking about the same idea. Who is in charge of the GLC's appointments per se? Does it feel that there is and transparency standards that would help? Can the establishment of a powerful parliamentary system achieve this? Basically, Parliament buka lah. Is what people are asking. Does that help? Yeah. I don't know how else to summarize that, but what sorry, I muted myself. But what would be the ideas that the panelists have regarding this thematic question?
So if I may, if you look at the structure, the GLCs as it's now, the point has been made by Nazir. What we have in the political system is a massive concentration of political power in the office of the executive. And with the GLC system, we also have now a concentration of political power and economic power in the office of the executive. That's why whoever controls the executive has no desire to revamp this work. There is some devolution of this power to the ministries, for example. So ministers also have it. So they all benefit from this system. That's at the federal. At the state level, the chief ministers have recognized that they too can create a GLC system where the power is in the office of the chief minister. So we have companies such as Chief Minister Incorporated, Menteri Besar Incorporated. And here again, we're seeing it replicated at the state level. Now, here's the point, Ibrahim, and I want to stress this. In 2018, after we had the general election, of the 13 state governments, 8 of them were under different parties. So 8 different parties, PAS, DAP, UMNO, Warisan, PBB, Bersatu, all of them had control of one state government. All of them had control over a GLC system. And all of them recognized how they could use that system to serve their vested interests. This is what we need to break. A delinking between the government and the GLCs, an arm's length relationship. That's why we've been calling for an independent commission. The government can own, the government can set the direction, but there should be some autonomy in terms of the GLCs and how they function. And I want to stress this point. This point has been made repeatedly by the panel members when we talk about the GLC. Well, I totally agree with what was said just now. Everybody is a GLC. They don't care whether it's a publicly listed firm, if it's an unlisted firm, if it's a statutory body, if it's a holding company, or even if it's a sovereign wealth fund or EPF or KWAP. They are GLCs. That is the problem. Each of them have to be dealt with separately. So that is why this independent commission also needs to look at the GLC world and designate what needs to be done for each of these different type of institutions, which now we collectively call GLCs. So there's much work to be done in terms of devolution of power and revamp of the political system.
Just a very short response. Who is in charge of GLC appointments and how do we achieve those transparency standards? I think that has been addressed. So IDEAS recently came out with a joint paper published with Bersay. And one of the recommendations there is to set up a parliamentary select committee for appointments. So I can imagine that the parliamentary select committee should not go through every single GLC appointment of the boards because there are so many GLCs, but it would have to set in place what the standards are. And it also has the power to call out for like audits of processes of these appointments. I also want to add something that I haven't really seen elsewhere or heard elsewhere, but I've been trying to make this point that, you know, if this road to reform, so to speak, is so difficult to achieve, that at least one of the lower hanging fruits is for government to change the way the chairmen are appointed as opposed to the board. So I think there's a distinction between the role that the chair and the board members should play. I mean, ideally speaking, nobody should be appointed just on the pure basis of political relationship because there should be merit. But I think setting in place a process for the chairman to not be politically appointed, I think that should be a relatively low-hanging fruit because the chair is a really important person. I mean, he sets the direction and the tone and the decisions for the particular entity in question. So yeah, I'll just stop there for now.
Because we are slowly running out of time, I'll probably take on two more questions. The first is Muhammad Shazwan. I suspect he's from CIMB. Is it possible that foreign investors not want to invest in Malaysia because there's too many GLCs and SOEs and the like, and that could become or perceived to be unfair? I think I might also be saying things like, is this problematic for us to become less attractive to foreign investors? Panelists?
Okay, Dato Sri.
Well, I mean, I think that is straightforward. I mean, at the end of the day, for investors to come in, they need to know what the purpose of the company is, and they need to have relative clarity in terms of the processes surrounding the appointment of leaders. So we go back to this point about how we select leaders, for instance. I think it's very important that we separate between, you know, SOEs, as I've redefined them, and, you know, listed government-owned companies. I certainly think SOEs should go through some parliamentary select committee process, whereas for GLCs, when the government is a shareholder, I think the government should show restraint and not exercise its powers and let the usual process of maybe public shareholders as well as the board remuneration nomination committee do it. But overall, certainly it is, you know, we need to grapple with this issue of how GLCs are governed and how GLCs are performing, because it is indeed undermining the foreign investment in the country.
Yeah, I'll just respond quickly as well. Oh, sorry, Prof. Very quick one. I think the short answer is yes, but I think the bigger question is, what do investors look for in any economy? They look for predictability, they look for stability, and the predictability is what I think this question is all about. So I'll bring in an example here on procurements, right? So one of the things I've heard from investors is that because our public procurement process is quite shrouded, it's not transparent, it's not as transparent as it could be. And these companies would therefore not even know the availability of a certain contract or an availability of a contract that's being made open, or a tender. Yeah, that was the word I was looking for. And the GLCs, because, and this one Prof. Terence knows better, there are many, many layers of the GLCs. I mean, if you investigate, it goes all the way down to like 10 levels or even beyond. And what happens at these lower levels of GLCs, so they buy into ownership of different companies, one layer, second layer, all the way to the 10th layer, is that they also become, they are in the competition to win those tenders and contracts. And this happens, right? So this happens at both the federal and the state levels. So there'll be an announcement of a contract, and perhaps a GLC that's somewhere down the line will compete for that tender and would probably be in a position to win it because of those political connections. And this is an example of how international companies would come in and realize that the competition is not fair. So the playing field is not level. Yeah.
I'd like to, I'm very pleased to hear this question because I'd like to go into a related area. Now, when we talk about foreign investors, I'd like to bring in the investments by China. Now, China is a country with a lot of state-owned enterprises. China is a very powerful state that controls the state-owned enterprises. China is now an investor in Malaysia through their state-owned enterprises. In Malaysia, we have our GLC system, our own state-owned enterprises, controlled by a powerful state. Two strong states controlling state-owned enterprises, negotiating deals on what should be done in Malaysia. That's what's happening. A classic example of this was ECRL. Now, that's the more complex issues that we are looking at now. If we do not reform the system quickly, where there's no transparency, the point has just been made by Tricia, and if we have powerful states coming together, using their GLCs or their state-owned enterprises to work together, they actually crowd out other foreign investors. In our research on China in Malaysia, it was very clear foreign investors were saying they cannot come into the country because all the concessions or all the contracts are being captured by state-owned enterprises from China. And who allowed it? Our government. And when we look at some of these companies, they are joint ventures, state-state. Now that's the future for us if we do not clean up the system. Now we will lose foreign investors also, and we may end up becoming quite dependent on China because China also is an economy which has very powerful enterprises which are also funded by the government. So they don't even need to worry about money when they come into the system. That's the future that we are looking at now. That's why this discussion that we are having today really is very important. What happens to domestic firms if that situation continues to perpetuate? Where will our domestic firms also stand? Will they be bought out? Will they have will they be inspired to invest in this kind of economy, which is being captured by these powerful state-owned enterprises? So I'm glad the question has been posed because it has allowed me to bring this up. And this is another issue we need to add on to the dialogue we're having today.
Okay, because of the multiple issues that we have touched upon throughout the entire 1.5 hours that we've had this conversation, let's move on to the final question posed by a participant, which is also a closing remark invitation actually. In summing up today's dialogue, can the panelists please comment on what are the immediate and upcoming role measures that the GLCs could play in the socio-economic recovery of Malaysia? This question is asked by Kat W. Wong. And I would like to take this opportunity to just basically land this particular aircraft that we've been traveling in and perhaps take some actionable steps moving forward, getting involved, getting a little bit more information, comparing and contrasting us with another model in another country, those kind of items. Let's do the other way around. So maybe Iskandar, you can start off with some closing remarks.
Thank you, Ibrahim. It's been a pleasure to hear all the thoughts and ideas from each of the panelists today. I've shared my recommendation earlier regarding how we can approach and reforming. So I'll just recap on what I think should be the way forward. So I think today the discussion is about fulfilling GLC, GLICs, and SOEs' purpose as vehicles to drive social impact. So fine, they need to make profit, but we need to ensure that their profit is made with a purpose. So we have seen this with private entities. They've pivoted towards a more purposeful operations. So GLCs, GLICs, and SOEs in Malaysia need to do the same. What more, since they are backed by the state, they need to be front runners in this area. So in terms of that societal impact, it needs to go beyond CSR. Has to be sustainable and it has to be long term. And we need to bear in mind, GLC is just another lever of state, or instrument of the state. Coordination among ministries need to be enhanced as well. If they are not coordinated, GLCs can't be coordinated. And regarding shaping the market, how it should be shaped and in what way it should be shaped, that we propose or advocate a different way of thinking, a proactive problem-solving type of approach. We now live in a pandemic. So we look at the purpose of rebuilding the economy post-pandemic. So we need to identify what do we need. Do we need food security, like Professor Terence said? And then what do we need to do that? Do we need to scale back some of the GLCs crowding out for other sectors to start a food security cluster among GLCs, private, public, and SOEs? So this kind of convening purpose or role that the government plays is very important to chart the way forward into the future. And I think I would like to leave a note for everyone, a parting note, that we should never recreate the wheel. We understand today that there are many types of GLCs already. There are many overlaps that we might not have identified, that we have identified some of it. So we need not create new entities, but we need to coordinate better. The tools are there. Use them better to develop the ecosystem where private players can crowd in. So we have Khazanah. When Khazanah invests in something, it needs to be looked into a long-term process. It shouldn't be a piecemeal project. It shouldn't be a project that just goes according to the whims and fancy of the current government. It needs to be well discussed and consulted among various parties. So obviously, oversight and coordination needs to be upheld before we can talk about purpose. So these items need to be in mind when we talk about purpose of GLC moving forward. And I do believe that GLC plays an important and integral role in rebuilding our economy and play a large role or significant role in making sure that Malaysia exits this pandemic safely. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Trisha, please.
All right, thank you. I just have 3 points to make. Number one, I think that similarly don't want to reinvent the wheel. The OECD has a really nice state-owned enterprise governance framework. In fact, IDEAS represents Malaysia instead of a government entity every year at an Asia state-owned enterprise governance Asia roundtable discussion. So hopefully there will be government representation in the future, because it's very strange. Every time we attend, the other representatives are all from government. So I hope that when the government does look through these reforms, they will also look at this SOE governance framework by the OECD. So it's all there, right? We actually can just refer to it immediately, number one. Number two, I just want to reiterate that in normal times, we should really be careful about allowing which kinds of GLCs to exist and which ones not to. So if they are not strategic, I've covered those 3 different strategic areas. We would not recommend that government should continue involvement in those GLCs. However, I think today's talk is not just in normal times, in times of crisis, right? So this is my last point. In times of crisis, which we can all accept that we are in a time of crisis, GLCs can come in to play some role that maybe is beyond that strategic scope, but by only a little bit, right? And if doing so, we need to do a few things as well. So the government needs to have a clear and transparent way of recognizing what role is it playing, what are the financial implications to the government's books at the end of the day, recognize it, take it into account, how much debt is it actually carrying the burden of, and think about what the long-term implications are. So we do not deny the need for it now, but it has to be recognized. And looking at the way that so many GLCs have come in, I think there was this GLC, GLIC disaster relief network, right? Looking at how all this financing has been coming in there, I really am concerned about who is keeping track of those, because I don't think it is. Like I said, IDEAS is only keeping track of the government's side of it, not the ecosystem. And I hope that even the ecosystem financial aid will be reported on in the future. So wishing you all the best, stay safe and stay sane during the lockdown. Thank you.
I'm trying to stay sane in this forum, actually, let alone, during the pandemic. But yes, Prof. Terence, go ahead.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Why are we here today? We organized this forum because Malaysia is in a deep crisis. The private sector is in lockdown. We have to look to the government. the government has the tools to save Malaysia. They called it the government ecosystem. They used it once. I'm worried that they're not using it properly again. Now, the two things here, I totally agree with Trisha on one point. Look, what we need to have is a big discussion about the role of the government in the economy. I'm sure Trisha and I will not agree on many things, but we still need to have the debate. But that's the long term. That's the long term. I'm concerned with the short term. When confronted in a crisis, what do we do? And here I'd like to take you back to the social market economy in Germany. When Germany was confronted with a serious crisis, the economy was in a complete mess. What did they do? We saw in Germany the coming together of government, private firms, and labor, people. A social compact was created. This compact, the social compact was created because they knew they collectively had to work together to save the nation. And that is what we are trying to do here today too. How can we come together, create a social compact where government, we the people, and enterprises together work together to save this economy and then to build it up again, because we are really in bad shape. Now here, this is why I was saying earlier, how did they go about doing it? Very simple. Government, they control the banks, and these banks give support to industries. Just one simple model. It happened under MCO1. The DFIs play a big role. And I'm looking to Nazir and I'm asking Nazir, you're in a key position, that's why we wanted you here. The SME banks, how do they play a role? And as for the GLC banks, which are publicly listed, is this the time for them to worry about profits? Or is this the time for them to put the nation first? In the health industry, in the pharmaceutical sector, even for publicly listed firms, is this the time to worry about profits? You own these companies. Take them, put them together, create a proper coordinated system and move in quickly to help people on the ground, to help the companies. We have other models where we have seen this occurring. Why can't we replicate it? That's short term. And that has to be done immediately. And I hope, and I want to close with this, I'm calling on the government to immediately form an independent commission to look at this GLC system, devoid of all politicians, coordinate these GLCs together in a well-planned manner to move into the economy quickly, because we have to do this urgently. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nazir.
Thank you. I mean, I think in terms of the comments about GLC long-term reforms, I would just reiterate that, I just don't think that any government, any incumbent government will deal with this unless we look at the whole situation holistically, because this is all intertwined. It's intertwined with how they hold on to power. It's intertwined with how they win power again and again. So unless we really go through, unpick this three-headed monster that I mentioned earlier and come up with, proper reforms, I don't think this GLC issue will be properly dealt with. And that is, of course, the long term. And I agree with Terence, we have an immediate and pressing concern, which is the pandemic. And we've not really talked about the pandemic, but I'd just like to flag that, I actually feel that this exit strategy that the government is coming up with this week is very important, because it will give rise to some clarity in terms of how they're thinking of it. And I do hope that the government does not just purely bank on the vaccines or herd immunity, because I do think that, judging by what's happening in the UK and some other countries, that there is a real risk that you're going to have the virus mutating to a point where maybe the vaccine is not as effective as we thought. I mean, already with the Delta variant, one is talking about herd immunity levels requiring needing to be about 85 to 90% rather than the original 70%. Yeah, so the government has to have multiple pronged strategy, including track and trace and isolation and etc. And I don't think we can assume that by August or September, lockdowns are behind us, because you could wake up tomorrow and you have a variant that's really vicious. So the economic impact of the pandemic is already severe could get more severe. And with that, I think we do need to bring together all our capacity in order to help people who really need help to actually keep the economy going as best as we can. And here, I'd just like to say that, perhaps there is room for us to look at the capacity of GLCs. I think Trisha's point is correct, that we need to look at capacity, because ultimately these are government entities, right? If we use the GLCs, then how do we fund it? How do we build them out? I think the government's been talking about its limited capacity a lot, and I agree the government has limited capacity. But one is whether there's still additional capacity in some of the GLCs. We don't know whether the government's gone through that process. Two is, I think capacity is also driven by income or revenues. And here, I think this side of that equation needs to be looked at, which is, can the government raise a lot more money by quickly coming up with new taxation schemes, etc., on the private sector as well, in order to pay for more government intervention in this against this pandemic. And finally, I go back to my first point, which is we do need I think Terence calls it a social compact, and I totally agree. We need to bring everybody together to really put their backs in the pandemic. I remember during the Asian financial crisis, women in South Korea were going up to government, giving their jewelry in order to help out with the Asian financial crisis then. We need someone to lead the country together, put all our resources on the table as best as we can, and to deal with this pandemic. Most important of all is, of course, the many people who lost their jobs and really can't put food on the table. What can we do to transfer funds or capabilities to them? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's important for us to take a quick check and try to see the mood of the room that we've had over the past close to 2 hours now. The way I would summarize it, there are 5 key points. The first is, of course, the long-term solution. It seems like in order for us to have clarity in terms of trying to achieve long-term solutions for redefining the role of GLC and how it impacts the people is a very, very long journey. It can be debilitating, in fact, if you think about it. And the idea here is to try to break it up to smaller parts and not lose sight for the long term. It seems to be popping up, that kind of theme every now and then amongst our speakers today. The second thing that I want to touch is the short-term solution. It seems like the short-term solution is very much tied down to how the pandemic is being played out. A lot of us might not realize this, but we know somebody that has lost somebody from COVID, even if we have not lost anybody ourselves. That's how close it is. The fact of the matter is the pandemic seems to be redefining itself to a point where it's going to be an endemic. And when that happens, what does it mean to the businesses of the day, our employment, the SMEs and the micro SMEs out there? It does bring about the impact of real situation to the people around us. The SME Corp was talking about 40% of that 800,000 going to be closed. They speak in future tense. I think we have to realize that for many, it's already past tense, let alone present tense. A lot of people have lost businesses, right? And we got to think about how that plays out for the rest of us. And that is the short-term solution that is needed, the urgency of it and the importance of it, right? The third is classification. Throughout the forum progression, we have moved from anywhere from Khazanah GLC CIB to Kejora of Johor, and I think that is emblematic. It's not. I think the framing of what we Malaysians think of what GLC is versus state-owned enterprises versus state-belonging entities and statutory bodies, we have to take a long, hard look into how we classify it, and all of us have to agree on what companies belong to which box, right? Because failure of which, then we have this convoluted conversation of what does who does what, right? So that is a theme that has come out or unearthed from this forum. The other two is, of course, oversight, mandate, and appointments. I think that everybody is in agreement, even though we might not agree with some points of each other. I think everybody agrees that some sort of oversight is important. Some questions, a lot of questions actually, we're talking about parliamentary reforms, parliamentary oversights, or something along those lines. But as Dato Nazir was mentioning, the three-headed monster, when it comes to money politics, identity politics, it's real, right? And therefore, asking for change is very, very hard because the political will might not be there. Which brings about the fifth theme on the political will and our role. The way I see it, for us to have this conversation is already a massive step forward, and I think it's important for us to take note that without which the agents of change is actually us. We're looking for some messiah somewhere. I think we really are in desperate of looking for a leadership out there, but I think if change starts with us, I think we can make it workable. Again, don't look at it as solving a bigger problem, break it into smaller pieces, and when we do that, I think it's achievable. Those are the 5 things that I feel has been unearthed through this particular forum. There is a chat box that was asking for feedback from participants, so please respond to that chat box, share your thoughts on how you think the forum went. And as closing statements, I would like to invite Professor of the Department of Economics, my ex-teacher actually, Prof. Aslam Hanif. Dr. Aslam, please go ahead and share your thoughts.
Thank you, Ibrahim. On behalf of everyone, I think especially the organizers, CAS, the technical support team from Futures Malaysia, I would like to thank everyone for having this great session this afternoon. Dato, Sri Nazir, Terence, Trisha, and Iskandar, thank you very much for the wonderful input. To excellent moderator Ibrahim, wonderful job. Thank you for making this Monday afternoon 2-hour session, so alive and interesting. And believe me, I think Terence and me as lecturers, we know how difficult 2 o'clock sessions are in the afternoon. I would just like to also maybe say, a couple of things. This is the second series, the second session in the series that we are organizing on the social market economy. And I think the main idea is to put forward alternative ways forward for Malaysia. A few of us from IIUM, from UNICEL, and from IDE, we also set up Futures Malaysia earlier this year with the particular goal of creating a platform for discussing these alternative futures. And I think as we go through this COVID-19 pandemic that has really had a big impact on all our lives, I think this visioning a better future is even more important now. It's also important that we are able to discuss with people from varied backgrounds, with all kinds of ideas. And I think if anybody knows those who are on the panel today, you will agree that we managed to get quite a good variety of views, except that today, as Ibrahim said, or as somebody said, everybody agrees with everybody else. So maybe GLC is a uniting topic, that we all agree that we need some serious reforms. But as I put in the chat, somebody suggested Parliament should be open. Yes, but when we get into Parliament and they don't make the reforms you want, then what do you do? So we have to keep pushing, and I think that's very important. This webinar series provides inputs that promotes ideas that I think we in Malaysia, we know less about. And I think, as Terence mentioned, the social market economy model, I think is something that we in Malaysia, maybe we don't know much about. We know about, liberal capitalism. We know about maybe the socialist models that we read in the textbooks and so on. But I think the social market economy model is something that we don't know sufficiently about. And that's why we are organizing this series of webinars. What the social market economy, I think, and especially in the case of GLCs, it allows us a chance to have a balance between market and state, between the public sector and the private sector, between the individual and society. I think Iskandar put it very nicely. business with a purpose. Although I can understand, that Sri Nazir was saying business with purpose is very tough when you're given benchmarks that are just the same as private sector. So it's a tough job for you to be doing that. But I think the social market economy model does provide us that not only the foundation and the theory and the model, but the practice. I mean, I think we all agree. The German example is a wonderful example of how we can find another alternative way. And I think this is what we can learn from today's session. Just to end, Dato Sri Nazir, you talked about we should all be united as a nation, at war with the pandemic, COVID-19. And I think we all agree that we need to be united on that in this, war situation. But I think GLCs also play a very, very important role. We need to be a nation at peace with each other. And maybe that is also something that I got from today's session, that somehow or other along the way, we've had tensions within, between the private and the public, between the state and the market. And of course, many other areas that were not discussed today, we're talking about ethnicity, religion, etc. And I think GLCs have that role. It can play that role of being part of nation building process. I don't know, maybe that's another burden that we put on GLCs, but I think so. It makes sense. It's somewhere in between. It can play the role of nation building. So with those, really, just a couple of observations. Thank you all for being with us. I'm not sure, do I give it back to Ibrahim? Is it back with you or?
Yes, particularly when the ominous bell has started to ring. So that is an indicator that we have to end this forum. But again, many thanks to the organizer, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, also the technical support provided by Futures Malaysia. Do check these two institutions out. Also, many, many thanks to the panelists, Iskandar Faris of Refsa, Trisha Yo of Ideas, Terence Gomez of UM, as well as Dato Sri Nazir Razak, for taking the time to speak with us and to share with us some of their thoughts and opinions for 2 hours. And of course, many thanks to you guys for tuning in, and thanks again for all the questions that have been shared to all of us. Until then, thanks, and see you in the next session of CAS, or Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's events. This is Ibrahim Sani. We're signing off as a panel together, and thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.